I don't know about you, but to me, one of the most beautiful and enjoyable things in this life is laughter, especially when it's free and unfettered like the laughter of a child. And personally, I'd say that a lot of us, myself included, are positively in love with that kind of laughter. We love it when someone makes us laugh that way, and we love to make other people laugh too. Basically, laughter is an amazing, beautiful gift to give, and it's an equally amazing, beautiful gift to receive. Partly because through laughter, we can experience some of the most sublime and joyful parts of our human nature. Our capacity to let go and to feel a sense of release, abandon, and playfulness. And at the same time, it's a kind of experience that lets us unshoulder a lot of the weight of feeling like we have to be rigidly sensible and appropriate all the time, and thoroughly ruled by all the shoulds and shouldn'ts of life. Basically, laughter and humor let us relax, at least for a moment or two, and take delight in the sheer joy of human existence. However, it also seems to me that laughter and humor are becoming a source of ever-increasing contention in today's world. One indicator of that would be the recent storm of controversy surrounding the comedian Dave Chappelle. Another would have to do with the cadre of well-known comedians such as Pete Davidson, Jerry Seinfeld, and Chris Rock, who now refuse to perform at colleges and universities. However, I'd also say that the real underlying issue is much larger than all of that. And it has to do not only with our perception of the value of humor, but with the very meaning of being free and responsible agents in this world, and the extent to which that's still a desirable thing. And with that teaser in mind, here's the usual table of contents for the material in this video. As usual, you can find the same table of contents in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. But before we begin, perhaps a couple of qualifiers are in order. First, the issue du jour isn't about defending absolute positions that derive from some sort of false dichotomy. It's not about choosing between absolutely unfettered freedom for humor or zero freedom for humor, both of which are pretty obviously unrealistic. Instead, the issue is about locating a healthy middle ground between those polar extremes, about whether we'd rather dwell in a world of relatively free expression with a few inevitable constraints, or a world of constraints with some inevitable freedom of expression. In other words, the issue has to do with a continuum of possible realities, rather than with staking out absolute and obviously untenable positions at the extremes. And in light of that, maybe I should also take a minute or two to describe my own particular biases within that continuum. Basically, I have a fairly substantial and abiding interest in things like laughter, humor, and comedy, and in the further reaches of free speech more generally, for that matter. I personally value laughter and humor very highly. I have a pretty zany and irreverent sense of humor myself, and I even wrote and performed stand-up comedy for a couple of years. So basically, humor is a very personal thing for me. And so I'd say that I'm definitely biased toward recognizing and safeguarding a fairly wide latitude for its expression, especially since I regard it as an important art form that does a lot to improve both our individual lives as well as the world more generally. So I guess that's my trigger warning for today. So at this point, proceed at your own risk. Anyhow, if you're still here, then let's start exploring what the value of humor actually is. As I suggested a minute ago, things like laughter, humor, and comedy first allow us to find joy in the playful side of human existence. In that regard, humor is a way of laying claim to the full range of our human birthright, to the wide terrain of human possibility, and not only to the parts that have been deemed safe, sensible, or appropriate. In other words, humor has value because it's part and parcel of the larger adventure of human existence, which would be very much diminished without it. And if you don't believe that, try imagining what a world without humor would really look like. A world where it's been eradicated or perhaps reduced to a mass of inoffensive and ineffectual banality. Would you really prefer to live in a world like that? Well, I guess it's a pretty personal question, and maybe some people would, but personally, I wouldn't. Of course, I suppose that we could all get used to a world like that. After all, we human beings are some of the most adaptable creatures on the planet. And it would always be possible for us to find other sources of joy in life besides humor. I don't know, maybe we could all take up knitting, or maybe refurbishing antique typewriters. But then the question is, yeah, but why would you want to have to do that in the first place? So I'd say that the first value of humor lies in the fact that it's a way of experiencing the joy of life itself, and is hence an important part of our fundamental human birthright. But beyond that, humor can provide us with new and surprising perspectives on things. And a lot of those perspectives can help us perceive reality more deeply and more clearly than we otherwise would be able to. Personally, I'd say that's true of pretty much every comedian that I've come to appreciate and revere over the years, which would include the likes of Bill Hicks, George Carlin, Bill Burr, Norm Macdonald, R.I.P., Stephen Wright, Dennis Miller, and yes, the now controversial Dave Chappelle. And learning to see things in new and surprising ways is important because, well, because as Frank Zappa once said, without deviation from the norm, progress isn't possible. So I'd say that the second value of humor has to do with how it can shake us out of our routine way of seeing things so that we can then start to expand our awareness, which in turn offers the promise of improving our world more generally. And of all of the ways that humor can possibly do that, I'd say that none is more important than that of helping us move more toward wisdom. And here maybe I should inject a short provocative quote from the poet William Blake, who rather famously proclaimed, "If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise." But how do humor and folly do that? How do those sorts of things help us become wise? Well, for one thing, humor tends to undercut a lot of the pretensions of our overweening self-seriousness. You know, all of our preachy self-righteous posturing and moralizing, and along with it, the ridiculous presumption that we really know what's best for the world, together with our rabid desire to impose it on everyone else by force if necessary, damn it. Whew. All of which is something I call the dictatorial impulse. Basically, the ugly, troll-like wannabe dictator that dwells inside pretty much all of us in one way or another. So I'd say that the third value of humor would be that it helps us move a little bit closer to wisdom, especially by inviting us to let go of a lot of our self-seriousness and dictatorial desires. However, at the same time, I'd say that humor invites us to move more toward humility, which I suspect is a common correlate of wisdom, and more specifically, the kind of humility that allows us to see things as they really are, rather than as we want them to be. Of course, becoming humble in that way usually involves a significant deflation of our egoistic self-importance. And it's naturally very easy to be offended and hurt by that. And yes, it definitely is one of life's great tragedies to discover, much to our chagrin and horror, that we're not actually the center of life, the universe, and everything. And that's an uncomfortable realization that I'd say most of us have to confront as we mature over time. But whether we can embrace it or not, the reality of human existence is that we're all infinitesimally small beings in an incomprehensibly vast and complicated universe. And we're here in this world for an unpredictably brief span of time. Our lives, all that they are, all that they mean, and all that they'll ever amount to, streaking like falling stars across the unfathomable sky of the universe for a fleeting moment or two, and then fading forever into obscurity and darkness. And against that ineffable backdrop, the idea that we really know what's going on, enough to be telling other people how they should be thinking and feeling and speaking and what they should be laughing at, is perhaps the most inane and ridiculous joke of all. A form of comedy perhaps on par with a hyperactive 8-year-old who can't stop making silly farting noises under his armpit at the dinner table. And so the fourth value of humor would be that it helps us move toward humility, and at the same time invites us to see things as they actually are, rather than as we want them to be in our self-important fantasies. But beyond all of that, one of the most striking things about fools and clowns and comedians is that they occupy a very unusual, almost shamanic place in our world. A place where they're allowed, at least historically, to violate taboos and speak truths that are forbidden to everyone else. Hell, even to presidents and kings. Basically, fools and clowns, and perhaps to a lesser extent children and artists, are allowed to say what everyone else is thinking, but which is prohibited by social constraints. They're the relatively rare souls who can admit out loud that the emperor is naked, when the rest of us are feeling like we have to keep praising the splendor of his wonderful raiment, while inside what we're really thinking is, WTF, dude, your shlong is flopping around in the wind. In that way, humor has value because it makes forbidden things speakable. It moves what would otherwise remain frozen inside of us into the warmth of the shared social world, so that we can be honest and straightforward about it, which in turn helps us grow and develop as human beings. So I'd say that the fifth value of humor is that it loosens the bonds of arbitrary social repression, which ultimately helps us be more honest with ourselves, which then helps us grow and develop personally. And speaking of shamanism, perhaps I should move toward ending this little list by making note of the fact that humor involves learning to honor both chaos and order. It helps us to learn to balance spontaneity and surprise against the world's regularity and predictability. To balance the magic of this existence against the mundanity of it. And I suspect that that's a big part of why the dictatorial impulse so often finds humor and comedy and just plain making fun of things to be objectionable. It's not merely because humor tends to undermine our overinflated self-importance, which would be reason enough. It's also because chaos, magic, and Dionysian celebration run counter to the dictatorial impulse's fundamental interests, which usually revolve around trying to control and regulate everything. But of course, as Hamlet once put it, there's certainly more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in that philosophy. So the sixth value of humor would be that it teaches us the shamanic skill of walking in multiple worlds simultaneously, especially by safeguarding a space for magic, spontaneity, and Dionysian celebration within the larger ambit of our lives. So, let's take a second to summarize. As I see it, the value of humor lies in 6, count them all, trade them with friends, principal areas. First, it's a way of experiencing the joy of life itself, and is hence an important part of our fundamental human birthright. Second, it can shake us out of our habitual way of seeing things, especially so that we can start to expand our awareness, which in turn improves our world more generally. Third, humor invites us to move a little bit closer to wisdom, particularly by inviting us to let go of a lot of our self-seriousness and dictatorial impulses. Fourth, it also helps us move toward humility, and at the same time invites us to see things as they actually are, rather than as we want them to appear in our self-important fantasies. Fifth, humor loosens the bonds of arbitrary social repression, which ultimately helps us be more honest with ourselves, which in turn helps us grow and develop as human beings. And finally, humor teaches us the shamanic skill of walking in multiple worlds simultaneously, especially by safeguarding the place for magic, spontaneity, and the celebratory Dionysian principle within the larger arc of our lives. Of course, some forms of humor embody those sorts of values much more than others do, and some forms of humor probably embody them very little. But still, it seems to me that the whole hue and cry over humor these days has mostly to do with the question of whether values such as those are still affirmable in our world, or whether their place in our lives has diminished so much that we can now do away with them, either in whole or in part, especially if doing so would help us feel a little bit more comfortable and a little bit less offended. And that's a very real issue, especially insofar as it's not actually humor's job to be something comfortable or inoffensive. Sure, as an art form, its purpose is to entertain us and to be a source of joy and solace in our lives. But it's also about unsettling and challenging us in various ways, and providing us with an impetus to improve ourselves, especially so that we might eventually begin to build a bolder and brighter world together. Just a thought. So, all in all, I'd say that if there's a single word for the kind of comedy that never risks any sort of discomfort or offense, the kind that always stays as safe and unobjectionable as possible, never hazarding anything brave or dangerous or courageous, that single word would be unfunny. But of course, that may be just me and my personal taste, and you're allowed to have your own opinions. Anyhow, at the end of the day, it seems to me like it's pretty much an exercise in futility to avoid offending everyone on the planet, in comedy or anywhere else in life. That's because one of the great constants of human existence, in case you haven't noticed it, is that there's always going to be someone who's offended no matter what. Basically, no matter what you say and no matter what you do, there's always going to be someone whose panties are going to be twisted up in a great big gargantuan knot about it. And I don't think you have to look through too many YouTube comment sections to find an easy confirmation of that. And so, of all of the lessons that humor and comedy can teach us, perhaps the greatest would be that while other people always have the right to be offended and outraged, we always have the right not to care. Not even for a second. And beyond that, it's a salutary thing to encourage each other to assume responsibility for our own negative reactions, and to help each other grow beyond the tight confines of our dictatorial impulses along the way. And ultimately, it's also a salutary thing to recognize that we live in a wide world with a very great diversity of perspectives on things, on humor and on pretty much everything else, too. So let me close with what I hope will be a few provocative questions. How free are we really when we're no longer at liberty to be silly, or childish, or stupid, or offensive? When we can no longer take a chance, at least now and then, on expressing what we really think and feel, whether it's appropriate or not? How free are we really when we have no choice but to toe the line of someone's personal ideological agenda and worship slavishly at the temple of some self-appointed dictator's hollow tin gods? How free are we really when our world starts to look like that? Personally, I'd say not that much. In fact, at that point, what we call our freedom is probably little more than just a sham, just a kind of cheap and feckless pantomime, most likely aimed at making us feel a little bit better about the appalling extent of our enslavement. And when you think about it, well, hell, what do our lives even matter when our freedom and the responsibility that goes along with it have been reduced to a narrow range of trivialities? When we can no longer scream to the very skies that today, yes, today, the emperor is very definitely naked, and his shlong is indeed flopping around in the wind. Anyhow, I guess that's my little homily on humor and its value, especially in our world these days. Once again, thanks so much for listening and watching. I definitely appreciate your time and attention. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.